My very first conference was in Yugoslavia, and I had to travel alone to get there. And I got to the hotel where she was putting all of us up, and there she was in the lobby, greeting each one of us with a big hug. And in the early classes, in the more general classes, she was simply a very good lecturer. She would use slides. She would have guest speakers, and she like Ruth Tringham, and she would make the classes very interesting. But there was a new dimension added in the 80s. After I finished my degree, she was giving seminars in her office, in her very wonderful, spacious office, on mainly we were discussing female figures, and we were discussing at that time Old Europe. And several of us would meet around her desk, and we'd bring food, and we'd sort of have a party, and she'd show slides, we'd talk about what we were reading, she'd assign us works to study, we'd write papers sometimes, and I mean, there we were, many of us postdocs sitting at her feet, because she had, not only did she have so much to teach us, she was so wonderful that the most enjoyable thing possible was to go to a party in her office. And a lot of my current work was shaped in those days by what I was studying and reading. A lot of my current interests really stem from that time working with her. She had a very personal interest in each of us, and our discussion always transcended academia. It always, she wanted to know if our lives were okay, if our relationships were okay. We had, in various times, many discussions about her relationships, my relationships, that were quite wonderful. Well, when she first came to the United States in the 50s, she was working at the Peabody Museum in Harvard for no money, but they gave her a space to do her research. And out of that came her first major book on early cultures of Eastern Europe, which was a perfectly traditional, exceptionally well received tome in the world of archaeology. It was beautifully researched, and I still have it. In 1974, she published what was then called The Gods and Goddesses of Old Europe, which later was republished as The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe, and things changed. She had always published about religion. And virtually every book she wrote, there would be a section on religion. Even the Thames and Hudson books on the Balts and the Slavs had sections on religion. And if you look at the other Thames and Hudson archaeology books, none of the rest, well, that I've looked at, and I've looked at many, have sections on religion. But this was a passion of Maria's, and she had even done Old Lithuanian religion and iconography for her master's thesis. So this was always a passion of hers, but it never bothered archaeologists until she started writing about female figures. I think if she had done traditional mythology and folklore, still she would have been well accepted. Once she began focusing upon female figures, this changed. The benefit I see in trying to understand prehistoric religion is that it gives us a context for the artifacts, that we're not looking at cold artifacts. Why do we study the artifacts if we don't want to know about the people? And the fact that these figurines were found, of so many sorts, were found in domestic contexts of many sorts as well, near bread ovens, in hearths. The fact that what seemed to have been shrines, which had figurines and other objects which seemed to be religious, were found right in the center of other buildings, right amongst other buildings, rather than removed, rather than in a special sacred area, sacred temenos, if you will, makes it seem to me as though religion was integrated into everyday life.
Right. So it's just part of the fabric.
I think,
yes, it is in Native American.
Right. I think it was part of the fabric of cooking, baking, pottery making, probably weaving. I remember I probably was at her house maybe 3 weeks before she died, just before she went to the hospital. She still had these stacks of papers she was working on. You know, she was just voracious. And I believe that she really assimilated very well all the evidence that she had subsequently used in her books. She was a linguist. It's essential to have more than one type of information that leads you to your conclusions. If you only have archaeological evidence, you don't have the full picture. But by finding out the core vocabulary for Indo-European languages, we can figure out, for example, what the homeland must have been, not just by tracing Indo-European burials or kurgans, but by knowing what the flora and fauna were, what was eaten by people, what the social structure was. You can tell very well what the religion was of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. All of this fits in one little piece of one more piece of the jigsaw puzzle. I think civilization exists whenever people have a society which they construct together and which works. Civilization exists when people have enough leisure time that they can pursue the arts, that they can pursue aesthetic occupations, pottery making, singing, dancing. We have evidence of all of this from the earliest Neolithic throughout Old Europe. Gorgeous pottery, beautifully tempered, bright colors, intricate designs, and they're relatively consistent throughout Old Europe. The same kinds of motifs appear over and over again. These people had a very well articulated aesthetic, and Maria's belief, which I happen to agree with, is that this artistic aesthetic was interwoven with their religious beliefs.
Right.
So I see men and women carving figures of which represented beliefs that were very important to them. So if they're carving figures of women in every aspect of life, from young girlhood to old womanhood, all these aspects of a woman's life are important to that culture. Not just birth giving, but perhaps decision making. You know, perhaps all possible occupations, all possible phenomena. That doesn't mean that there weren't societies when men and women just went about, did their work, did what was necessary to make the society a good one without having to have dominance over one another. I think she was one of the most forward thinkers of our time. I think that her theories and her evidence will change the face of knowledge. She loved to have parties at her house. She loved to invite people who had brilliant ideas to her home and invite other people to come hear them. She loved to cook for people and serve them food, always on her best china. Even in her last weeks, you would go there and she would make sure that someone had made tea for you and had some cake to serve you on beautiful china, right up through the very end.
Наш лайтитесь, юс, атликсит наш Iti